Hi, everyone. Nice to be here this morning, and also thank you to the Ehlers-Danlos Society for inviting me to come. I'm really happy to be here, and I always enjoy these conferences and meeting new people and hearing people's stories and seeing how everybody can change through all the work that we're doing. So thank you so much. Wait, get my thing together here. Good. I have no disclosures. And just a little bit about where I'm coming from. I live with Ehlers-Danlos myself. I was a flailing dancer, didn't know what to do about it, couldn't balance at all, and so was really looking for something that would help me. And I found the Alexander technique, and I really credit it for giving me, basically giving my life, my movement life back, and helping me understand what and how I could move. So that's what we're going to look at today a little bit. Sometimes we're going to do some really local ideas, and then sometimes looking at the big concepts of the Alexander technique so that we can figure out what to do in the moment when we need some help. And the thing that I think the Alexander technique gives us the most is this idea of self-agency. What can we do to help ourselves? When can we do it? And how can we do it? What do we think about? How do we go about remembering to do that? Those are all things we're going to talk about for a second. So one of the big ideas with this is that our own thinking makes a big difference. Right? So if you're thinking, for instance, I was talking with someone here last night, if you're thinking you're supposed to let your shoulder hang, you're probably going to do that. And it's probably going to have some kind of effect on your shoulder joint. If you're thinking that you're in a structure that supports your shoulder and your whole body, that's going to help integrate your shoulder into everything that you're doing. So we're going to look at a paradigm for the body, a structural paradigm, that's going to help you understand what you're doing. The Alexander technique is an educational process, and so the focus is on learning what to do, not on being fixed. The idea is that you're going to learn, again, when to pay attention, what to pay attention to, so that you can take away these ideas and play with them, explore them, become curious about them, so that you can apply the principles of the Alexander technique in action. When you become curious about things, it stops being right or wrong, and you start getting in that exploratory field where you can say, oh, is this better? Let me do it again, let me see. And so you can start to see what works for you and your condition at the moment. Every single day that is different, and see what works with you for that. So mostly the Alexander work is done individually, where you get individual attention with your own patterns and habits. And sometimes it's done virtually, sometimes it's in a group to give different ideas. So when to think, what are your choices? This is what we need to figure out, what the choices are for you and when you're going to do them. So we need to look at the how of what you're doing, and we need to look at the habits of what you usually do, so that you learn what your choices are. As a hypermobile dancer, I had too many choices. I could be here and there, and my proprioception was basically all the same. And I could never figure out what I was supposed to be doing and where I was supposed to be until I got some guidance and some feedback from someone to help me understand what I should be doing. So I needed to figure out how to balance myself rather than lean on my joints. For instance, if I start to go to stand up, if I lead with my head and poke my head forward, I realize that puts a lot of pressure on my body, and I need to learn how not to do that, how to make a different choice, and how to work. So we look with what our predicted behavior is. So what are we predicting? Often at the beginning, we don't even know what we're predicting, but we have to figure out what we're predicting and then start to let that go, loosen that up a little bit, and start to make some other choices. So this moment of choice and this moment of action is really what we need to look for at all different levels. And we're informed at that moment of thought and choice by all kinds of things that have come before. What we've been taught previously. For instance, if you've been taught you're supposed to let your shoulder hang, that's what you're going to be looking for. If you're going to be taught that you've should breathe in a certain way, or that you need to grab onto yourself before you do something, or here's an example of one of my students with breathing. We were working on breathing for a long time. She has some breathing concerns, and we're going along, this is like maybe years, right? So then she finally says one day, well, you know, in the 3rd grade, my choir teacher told me that I should be breathing this way. And I'm going, this is not the 3rd grade anymore, and we have a whole other bunch of knowledge to bring, and your understanding and your ability to put things together is really different than it was in the 3rd grade. It's really fascinating that a lot of these things that we're functioning from are deeply inside, and we need to play with them and start to let them surface so we can figure out how to work with them, how to work with those habits that have been there potentially for a long time. So it's really our history, our culture, what we've been told, what our previous experiences in doing this action. This is why the exploring needs to be put in the picture, so that we can say, the last time this happened, let me see when I do it slightly differently, what goes on this time. So it's critical then that we stay in the present moment with what we're doing. And from the Alexander technique point of view, building awareness is really the how of what we're doing. We need to learn how to pay attention, the attention that's going to help us change in our bodies. How we think, again, affects our body and our movements. So what and when? When are these moments? One student of mine said, finally, she just blurted it out. She goes, well, how can I expect to do something different if I do the same, have the outcome be different if I do the same thing all the time? That's really worth thinking about, because, oh, I have to do something different in order to have a different outcome. So the goals of all this work are to find a dynamic balance so that we can stabilize ourselves. So by dynamic balance, we're talking about a balance that can change, so that as we learn to move around, we are continuously allowing ourselves to redistribute the tone in our bodies so that we can maintain that balance as we go along. We want to be able to utilize gravity, the pull toward the center of the earth, and the natural inherent force, the ground reaction force, which is sometimes associated with the Alexander work of going up and feeling that rebound that comes up off the center of the earth. So this is something that we can experience when we organize and set up the conditions for this force to happen, which is what happens when we dynamically balance our body. If we're leaning on our joints, we're actually helping gravity out. We're going with gravity, and we're sort of collapsing on ourselves in a way, rather than setting up those conditions to experience the ground reaction force so that we can take pressure off our system. And the idea here too is to learn what works for you on a daily basis. Learn what works for you so that we can continue to cultivate those things, so that you actually use your instability to create stability. So that we are using the instability, we're allowing that to start to, it's kind of like being on a slack line. When you get on the slack line, you're like wobbling all over the place, and then all of a sudden you start to understand how to utilize the gravity, and not that I've been on one recently, but that you start to see that ability to come up and balance without holding on, and that's what's necessary. So in order to do that, we then need to reduce the interferences, reduce the habits that are in the way of experiencing the gravity and the rebound. We need to develop new habits, new ways of thinking. So let's just look at a few common interferences. As I just said, leaning on your joints is a big one. Poking your head forward, and over-lengthening the spine or reaching away from gravity. These all put pressure on the system and take us away from our full dimensional selves, which is really what we want to embody. So we want to cultivate this natural resilience in our systems. So let's just look again at that a little bit specifically with leaning on the joints. So in the middle is a fairly good alignment for posture for a person. The thing that I'm not talking about here is the stacked model, right? I'm talking about a dynamic balancing model where things are all relating to each other. So you can see with the person on the left that they're kind of pushing their pelvis back, and that's also shortening the natural curves of the spine, which we want to maintain also. And it shows some interference, so that person is probably going to experience themselves as relatively heavy as they go along. And everything relates to each other. And then the person on the right side there is pushing their knees back, which then in a compensatory way pushes the pelvis forward and puts a lot of pressure on the back of the neck up here. I recently had a new student come in who was leaning basically just like this, and our entry point into her pattern was to release the knees, even just a little bit. And to see that, of course, then some of her musculature had to come online that has been on vacation, but then she was able to immediately sense that that was going to release the top of her neck, and that she was then going to be able to work a little bit with the headaches that she was getting, because all this pressure, maybe not all, but a lot of the pressure was going to be able to come off way up here. So it's kind of entering your pattern almost anywhere, because we're connected all the way through our system, is going to help the whole pattern. In a way, the Alexander works in sort of this indirect way. So I sent her off with homework to pay attention to unlocking her knees, and she's going, that's going to help my headaches. And we talked about it, and it was really clear that she could sense immediately that, yes, this is the way to start. Because often something sort of gross like locking our knees is more tangible, and we want to find something that we can actually pay attention to, that we can notice, that we can bring into our awareness consciously and figure out how to work with that. Okay, here's a slide from one of Dr. Pradeep Chopra's presentations at an EDS gathering like this, where he very clearly lays out that what he calls the poking head forward syndrome actually puts a lot of stress on your system. And if you look at the one on the right, you'll notice that that is 7.6 centimeters forward and 19 kilograms extra on your body, in your back. So it is really important that we pay attention to our posture and we start to get our alignment going in a better direction. So the process for this is what F.M. Alexander understood. And he was lost his voice, and he went to doctors and was not able to figure out what was going on. So he, and I think this is actually a really helpful point with the Alexander work, is that he decided to take a look for himself at what he was doing and how he was using himself. You know, some people say, well, we get these bodies and we don't get a user's manual. And that's kind of true, that we just imitate people when we learn how to do things, but often we just like go along until something happens to us. So he paid attention through mirrors, through observing himself. He was an Australian man who was able to actually get his breathing back, his voice back, by observing himself, by changing his habits, by looking at his habits of collapse and reorganizing his posture. So he really developed his own self-agency, and that's what he starts to teach, was teaching all of us. He then moved to England and then came to the United States and worked a lot with actors and on their voices, and was able to make a big difference in a lot of people's lives. So again, the how is to bring your awareness and your attention to the moments that make a difference, putting in a gap, giving a pause, so that you can attend and think and redirect yourself in that moment, make a new choice about how you're going to do what you're doing. You can redirect your thoughts, give a pause, insert your awareness. I like to say, okay, this is where you insert your awareness. Notice what's happening, make another choice, find the ground, find the rebound, and away you go. So this giving a pause looks like this. You're doing an action, you pause before the action to start with. Like if I were to ask you to stand up right now, I'd say, wait, think about what you're doing, find the chair, and then come up to standing from where you are there. So you're getting that way. Then you can think eventually during the pause, as you redirect, and then moving from that new place, that new organization of your structure and your system is going to give you a new experience and start to refine your use and your posture. So eventually you start to do an activity and you're putting in these little gaps. So you chunk things up, we like to say, and you put in awarenesses all along, and then eventually you're starting to pay attention all the time as you go through all your gaps. So, some common useful things to put in your gaps. Find the ground. Literally sense the ground and organize yourself so you start to feel that ground reaction force through your spatial thinking of cultivating the ability to hold those oppositional forces together at the same time. And I think this takes some doing. This takes some practice to be able to sense those oppositional forces. And your breathing. So gravity, ground reaction force, breathing, spatial thinking. And with the ground reaction force, I like to have this be thought one, because that really keeps us on the planet. And you can actually experience this upward emergent property of direction and flow that comes through you when you organize yourself well. So, releasing your feet on the floor, sensing all your sit bones on the ground, sensing the upward flow through your body. I can't say this enough, which is why I have 2 slides for it, because I think this is really important to give a starting point for what's going on, because the ground and the ground reaction force are the strongest forces that we're dealing with in our structures. Recognize that you're fully dimensional, and notice that I'm not saying 3-dimensional. Sometimes people get planar when they think of 3 dimensions rather than fully dimensional. Think of your oppositional directions. The ground and up are the most strong oppositional forces, but there are forces throughout your whole body that go in these directions. If we look at the Biotensegrity model as a paradigm for your structure, and again, as opposed to the stacked model or the model where you're hanging by a string, for instance, then you start to see that these forces go in all directions. And so there's a force that goes from my fingertips into my shoulder, through to the other side, through to the other side there. So there are oppositional forces that flow through our structure in all directions. You can see this kind of Biotensegrity model in the spine and how that works as well. So you can also see here then if one thing gets stuck, then the whole thing is going to be affected by that. So we want to utilize our whole body with this. So this leads to the concept of throughness, which is also this sense of sensing your flow through your structure. This is a term I've borrowed from the horse world, where the horse senses the body weight of the rider into the floor, and then it comes right back up, as you can see. So the rebound is there and the gravity is there as well. Specific spatial thoughts, I think, are important. Again, that you're fully dimensional. Notice that your parts relate to each other. So the same thing, if I release my knees, my neck can start to let go. I can sense the space inside my body. I can relate that to the space around me in the whole room, for instance. You can keep track of all those things and gain actually a literal perspective on what you're doing. Your breathing supports your spatial awareness. It creates flow and energy. It undoes interferences from tension and starts to integrate everything that you're doing, all of these elements. So you can see that all these relate to each other, right? So you get your organized self, that gives you a sense of the ground, which leads you to throughness and a sense of the space around you. So again, the Alexander technique teaches self-agency. You have choices that you can make. There's lots of choices that you can make. So you want to learn what you're doing, you want to learn when to think. I suggest you learn to start thinking before you do an activity. It might at first seem like it's slowing you down, but there'll be a lot of benefits for it. So it takes curiosity, patience to explore, it takes time, it takes tenacity, it takes the desire to change, the willingness to feel something new and different and explore those possibilities. The Alexander technique is taught in private lessons, sometimes virtually, group sessions, based on all of these principles. We also do lie-down components, and they're readings for the theory. So, this all adds up to change. And there you go. So, play with these ideas, keep going, don't give up, stay with it, explore, make some new choices. Thank you very much.